One could easily argue that there is no protagonist of Nathaniel Hawthorne's novel, The House of the Seven Gables. Certainly, the novel ends happily with Holgrave and Phoebe uh, headed for what seems to be a hopeful future and a stable marriage. But these characters come on fairly late in the novel. Hepzibah gets a lot of attention early in the novel, but her character fades into the background to a certain extent. Uh, Basically, we can call The House of the Seven Gables an ensemble narrative, which makes sense because it is more about a family and its history than about any one individual member of that family. However, one could conceivably suggest that the protagonist of the novel is, if not any one of the characters, the narrator himself. Uh, if you start reading the novel closely, you realize that even though the narrator is seemingly telling the story through third person, he does report as if he is the proverbial eye in the sky, able simply to watch what his characters are doing and simply reporting on what they're doing. Uh, but yet, at the same time, this narrator is constantly imposing himself upon the narrative. He's constantly commenting on what he's doing. He's commenting on possibilities that the characters might not themselves be aware of. He's also constantly reminding readers of what the moral of this novel is. As the shaper of this narrative, he interestingly combines first person and third person in such a way as to say, this is a story that really happened. That's where the third person part comes in, and I'm going to report it to you. But also, this is how I'm deciding to tell you what happened. And that's where the first person aspect comes in. In constantly reminding us that he's telling the story, he's really foregrounding his own presence as the most important factor in the narrative. Regardless of how important any one character might be, clearly the maker of that character, the shaper of that character, is going to be more important. So I want to talk for a bit about the narrator of House of the Seven Gables. I'm not arguing in a overly robust way that he is the protagonist, but I am suggesting that he has more presence in the novel than any other of the characters. Again, primarily because, as he constantly announces, he is shaping the characters, he is making the characters, and he is asking us to watch him make the characters. In this regard, to some extent, he resembles Holgrave, who at one point puts Phoebe in a mesmeric trance to tell her a story. And at the end of the story, there's a suggestion that he could keep her in this trance and basically tell her what to do. In some ways, the narrator is enacting the same. He's overtly shaping the narrative, trying very hard to control reader response to his narrative, and in some ways, we might say, trying to compromise the agency of the reader by constantly reminding the reader of what the meaning of the story properly is. There's another aspect to this. I'm going to tell you that the narrator, like a character, expresses tension. There seems to be one part of the narrator that is pushing for a rather cogent allegorical reading of the tale. And there's another part of the narrator who's pushing against smooth allegory and celebrating openness and variety. So let's get a sense of what's going on with this narrator. In the very first page, the narrator tells us that he knows about the House of the Seven Gables. He visits it from time to time. So this is not a narrator who is distant from his material. He is implicated in the world that he's describing. He says, after describing the house with the acutely peaked gables, he says, the street on which this house rests is Pension Street. The house is the old pension house, and an elm tree of wide circumference, rooted before the door, is familiar to every town-born child by the little town of the Pincian Elm. On my occasional visits to the town aforesaid, I seldom fail to turn down Pincian Street for the sake of passing through the shadow of these two antiquities, the great elm tree and the weather-beaten edifice. So the author has had personal experience of the setting of this novel, which we might say gives him authority because he knows of what he speaks. But we could also say it invites prejudice because he is circumscribed by his rather local view. So let's have another example of how this narrator interacts with the story. So in describing Hepzibah for the first time, right when she's right on the verge of turning one of the rooms of the House of the Seven Gables into a little shop because she needs to make money. Her cousin Clifford is going to be released from prison in any day now, and she needs money to help support him. The narrator, as he describes Hepzibah, is constantly describing how he describes Hepzibah. For instance, he says, after discussing her, that she takes out a picture of a young man, very handsome young man. Now, Hepzibah being older and having a constant scowl and thick glasses, not fitting any traditional standard of beauty, could Hepzibah, this narrator asks, actually be looking at a former lover? And here's what he says. Can it have been an early lover of Miss Hepzibah? No, she never had a lover, poor thing. How could she? Nor ever knew by her own experience what love technically means. And yet her undying faith and trust, her fresh remembrance and continual devotedness towards the original of that miniature have been the only substance of her heart to feed upon. So this is one of many times where the narrator highlights Hepzibah's appearance and notes it as a result of a rather retired, dry, unproductive life. He's constantly describing her as a product of this long pension line that has now, because there's been very little influence from the outside, that has now become stagnant and almost moribund. In fact, he likens her to a long line of chickens in the pension barnyard who have been bred in such a way that there have been very little outside influences, and these chickens are now rather small and deformed and not very robust. So it's as if the narrator is trying very hard to tell us how to experience this character he's creating. Another moment worth looking at. So after describing at great length the garden right outside the pension household, the House of the Seven Gables, a garden that Phoebe struggles to bring back to life, a garden to which she brings Clifford, who is himself exhausted by life. Phoebe kind of revives him. The narrator says, the author needs great faith in his reader's sympathy, else he must hesitate to give details so minute and incidents apparently so trifling as are essential to make up the idea of this garden life. It was the Eden of a thunder-smitten Adam who had fled for refuge thither out of the same dreary and perilous wilderness into which the original Adam was expelled. So here is the narrator again allegorizing, telling us how to see this garden, because this garden is connected to a house that has been cursed by Matthew Mall, having been falsely accused of witchcraft by the progenitor of the pension line. One product of this house being cursed is the garden. It's Eden, but Eden in reverse. It's Eden as fallen. So it's Eden and non-Eden at the same time. So even though this garden might offer pleasure to Clifford and Phoebe, because of the cursed soil from which its growths spring, it is ultimately tainted, like Hephzibah. So these are just two examples of the narrator trying very hard to exemplify the moral of the tale that he lays out on the very second page of his narrative, where he says, one might draw a mighty lesson from the little regarded truth that the act of the passing generation is the germ which may and must produce good or evil fruit in a far distant time. That, together with the seed of the merely temporary crop, which mortals term expediency, they inevitably sow the acorns of more enduring growth, which may darkly overshadow their posterity. So from the very outset, he's saying, look, this is a story basically about how the sins of the fathers are visited upon their children. And Colonel Pynchon, because he basically stole the house from Matthew Maule and falsely accused Matthew Maule of witchcraft, and which led to Matthew Maule's execution, because of this sin, the whole line of the Pynchon family and the house itself in which they live are tainted, cursed, haunted. And of course, this can be seen as the lesson an allegory might teach. So when the author, trying to push this moral on readers, is constantly reminding us, say, about Hephzibah, or reminding us about the garden, or reminding us about the chickens, constantly saying, these are the results of a house that has been cursed. So we might say that there's an obsessive quality to this narrator. He's addicted to repetition. He's reductive to a certain extent. He's a great storyteller with all the detail he provides about characters in their landscape, but also in constantly reminding us of the main point of the story, he kind of compromises the pleasure of the story unfolding, the pleasure of the story being presented in such a way that the readers can participate more openly in discerning the meanings that might arise from the tale. In other words, this narrator has a real fixation on what we might call stasis. Here is my idea. Here's my idea. Here's my idea. Here's my idea. Oh, see this scene in the story? It exemplifies my idea. And in this regard, the narrator might remind us of a Pynchon, someone like Geoffrey Pynchon, the judge, who's constantly trying to enter into Hephzibah's house to try to find a deed that will give him what he thinks is family land. There's an obsessive quality about the Pynchon family. They're so fixated on this lost land. They're so fixated on trying to keep their line pure. There's a real affection for purity, stasis, power, stability. Now, I'm not saying that the narrator is as nefarious as Colonel Pynchon or Judge Pynchon. No. But part of the narrator's personality, if you will, is precisely trying to locate meaning and make that meaning stable and keep that meaning in front of himself and us in such a way that we are reassured that there is meaning in this narrative. One meaning. But there are other times when this narrator opens up another side of his presence, one indeed open to variety, heterogeneity, difference, presence, the present and the future, where the narrator feels less like Pynchon and less like Colonel Pynchon or Judge Pynchon, and more like Phoebe, who is a distant Pynchon, who brings sunlight and life and difference into the House of the Seven Gables, or Holgrave, who, well, we find out later is a Maule. He's not a Pynchon at all. He's a Maule, and he is the best storyteller in the novel. He tells stories to Phoebe, and as I mentioned earlier, mesmerizes her. So there's part of the narrator who has the qualities of these two younger characters who point to the future. Look at what he says. At one point, he starts talking about, again, what his story is about, but in doing so, he says that ultimately what makes a writer effective is not the embrace of purity and stability, but the opposite. Here's what he says: how can we elevate our history of retribution for the sin of long ago when, as one of our most prominent figures, we are compelled to introduce not a young and lovely woman, nor even the stately remains of a beauty storm shattered by affliction? Sorry, I misread that. How can we elevate our history of retribution for the sin of long ago when, as one of our most prominent figures, we are compelled to introduce not a young and lovely woman, nor even the stately remains of a beauty storm shattered by affliction, but a gaunt, sallow, rusty jointed maiden in a long waisted silk gown, and with the strange horror of a turban on her head? This is poor Hepzibah he's describing again. Her visage is not even ugly. It is redeemed from insignificance only by the contraction of her eyebrows into a near-sighted scowl. And finally, her great life trial seems to be that, after 60 years of idleness, she finds it convenient to earn comfortable bread by setting up a shop in a small way. Nevertheless, if we look through all the heroic fortunes of mankind, we shall find this same entanglement of something mean and trivial with whatever is noblest in joy or sorrow. Life is made up of marble and mud, and without all the deeper trust in a comprehensive sympathy above us, we might hence be led to suspect the insult of a sneer, as well as an immitigable frown on the iron countenance of fate. What is called poetic insight is a gift of discerning in this sphere of strangely mingled elements, the beauty and the majesty which we are compelled to assume a garb so sordid. So here there's an embrace of mixture, of a kind of messiness. The novelist must have sympathy with this to tell a story powerfully. So we see the narrator enacting this part of himself when he does not remind us of the meaning, but pulls us into the intricate details of the story. There's a lushness to the writing. There's a density to the writing, where we can watch Phoebe Garden, or we can watch Clifford blow bubbles. Scenes that yes, they are significant to the overall meaning of the story, but they stand alone as pleasurable scenes that seem to exist simply because they exist. They aren't so consumed, or the narrator is not so careful to tell us this is what this means, but simply seems to get lost in his own narrative. So this part of the narrator, we might say, is open to forces that are not Pynchon-like, forces that come from outside of the House of the Seven Gables. And a final example of this comes near the end of the novel, when Geoffrey Pynchon has died, just as his ancestor, Colonel Pynchon, had died. And the narrator spends a whole chapter simply describing to us what Geoffrey Pynchon, now dead, is missing because he is dead. So this is the exact opposite of front-loading the moral and then being careful to tell us how each scene points to the moral. That's basically, we might say, trying to connect difference to the same. Whereas when he looks at this static being, this corpse, but from gazing at this corpse generates all these possibilities that now Geoffrey will not be able to enter into. Talking about how life goes on with Geoffrey not in it anymore. This is the opposite, where the narrator looks at a kind of sameness, looks at this same body throughout the entire chapter, but is constantly generating possibilities. Again, possibilities that this character will not inhabit, but there's a sense of the narrator being very open to life, and how life exists and life goes on regardless of this one person and this one Pynchon line and this one house. So it's almost as if a primary drama of the House of the Seven Gables is not simply, well, how will Phoebe turn out? How will Holgrave turn out? How will Hepzibah turn out? How will Clifford turn out? But also, how will the narrator turn out? Does the narrator himself dramatize some of his struggles? And I think the answer is yes. And it would be interesting to kind of track, are there moments in the novel where the narrator seems to gain insight that leads to his opening up to a difference in heterogeneity? So I'll stop there, but just to remind you that to read House of the Seven Gables without paying attention to how the story is being told would be almost like reading the novel while ignoring every description of one particular character. There would be a real gap in the story. So the narrator and his presence is just as important, if not more important than any other character in the novel.